Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you're watching this. I appreciate the fact that you've tuned in to watch Sunday School at the Cross, and I hope that your week is going well and the Lord is continuing to keep you safe. We want to today continue our looking at the question, is it true? And we have looked at a variety of different sub-questions. Is it true that we have what they wrote? Is it true that they believed what they wrote? Is it true that Jesus rose from the dead? Today, and all that we've been looking at up to this point, is the New Testament. We have found that the New Testament is what they wrote, that they believed what they wrote. But today I want to take a step a little farther and ask ourselves, is there any way to know about the historicity of the New Testament by looking at sources outside the New Testament? That's the question that we want to ask. Is there any mention of Jesus from anywhere else besides the New Testament? And so let's think about that today and ask ourselves some questions about historicity. First, we want to ask the question, what is historicity? That is, what exactly is the question that we are asking in terms of whether or not the things that the Gospels tell us are true? And the question is, how do you know that the Bible that we have today is the same one? We've already looked at that. We've spent a good deal of time on it. Then, after we realize that the tradition and the copying is accurate, how do we know that the writers didn't make up the stories? We've looked at that. And how do we know that the Bible is not just a myth that was embellished over time? Well, we've looked and we know that several people have died for what they wrote in the New Testament, and others went through a great deal of torture. And so we know that there's something different about this writing. And so we want to ask ourselves today, is it possible to look outside the New Testament and find something to do with Jesus? Well, there are a number of people, interestingly enough, that talk about Jesus outside of the New Testament. That is, historians or politicians or other religious documents that talk about Jesus. So let's look at what's going on there. First, there are ancient historians, particularly Josephus. You've heard me speak of Josephus before. Josephus was a historian who lived during the time of Christ and after Christ. And he has 4 famous books that are essentially all put together, and they are called Josephus. And there are a variety of places where Josephus mentions things that were going on during Jesus' times, and a couple of places where Josephus mentions Jesus himself. Josephus says this. He says, at this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. And that's a very significant piece of text for a variety of reasons. One, it is outside the New Testament. So this is not a religious statement being made by Josephus. 2, it comes from the time of Jesus. It comes from the very time, a person who lived during that time. And so Josephus is saying several things here. And one of the problems that has sort of come to be is that there's some textual shakiness around this statement by Josephus. That is, there are times in this particular section of Josephus that you see here, there are times when this section either doesn't show up in copies of Josephus, hand-preserved copies, or it shows up different from the way that we look at it there. And so one of the things, you can see this when I send you the slideshow, you'll be able to see that some of these words are in italics. Those words that are in italics are the words that are most questionable. And so, since Josephus was primarily passed down by Christians, it is within the scope that Christians passing this down, somebody made a comment out in the margin. The next copyist thought that marginal comment should be in the text, and somehow it gets into the text. That's entirely possible. But one of the things that we should realize is, A, we're not certain about that. There are Josephus scholars who will argue one way or another, and there are scholarly places that you can go to work through this. Generally, those who are against Christianity will try to take everything supernatural about Christ out of Josephus, and those who are less critical of Christianity will take less out. Not always. I mean, it's just that's generally the way it goes. But one of the things that we can say is that at the very least, Josephus mentions Jesus. Most scholars, regardless of their presuppositions, will grant the fact that Josephus mentions Jesus. And there's some significance in what Josephus says. He makes reference to Jesus' claim to be the Christ. Now, in some of the texts, Josephus will say he was the Christ, which it adds some questionability to the text. Because the Christ Christos is a Greek word for anointed, just like Messiah is the Hebrew word for anointed. So for Josephus, a Jewish man, to say that Jesus was the Christ, he would be saying that he was the Messiah. Unfortunately, I think that Josephus probably wouldn't have said that. If he were to say that Jesus was the Christ, then he would probably have then become a Christian. But you'll see here in this translation, he says he was perhaps the Messiah. A much more, a statement that would be much more, that Josephus would be much more likely to make. So he makes reference to that. Josephus speaks of his miracles. He talks about him having done certain miraculous events. This was apparently something that was known by a variety of people. Even if they didn't believe that Jesus was the Christ, they had heard about him healing blind people and leprous people and things like that. He points out, Josephus does, that people perceived Jesus' teaching as being true. So he doesn't say he went around doing these miracles and they were fraudulent and nobody believed him. That was a significant point that was being made there, because if no one had believed him, Josephus could have very easily said that. But what he says is that there were a great number of people, or at least a significant number of people, who believed that Jesus was telling the truth. Josephus speaks about Pilate in a variety of places. You can go onto the internet and find a copy of Josephus and run a search, and you'll find the number of times that Josephus speaks about Pilate. He speaks about crucifixion. He speaks about the cross, a variety of things. He recorded the claim by the disciples that Jesus was resurrected. And again, here we are running into some issues of textuality, but at the very least, in some texts, Josephus records the fact that his disciples said that he was resurrected from the dead. And that's a very significant claim that to show up outside of the New Testament. Then he documents the fact that Jesus had many converts. He documents the fact that Jesus had a variety of numerous people who were following after him. Now, as I've said, there are certain problems that we can run into when we're dealing with Josephus. So let's look at a couple of them. One, most scholars, and this is pretty much true, most scholars believe that there's some Christian interpolation, that is, that in the passing down of Josephus through a variety of Christian scribes copying the text, because remember, Josephus was passed down, hand copied in the same way that the New Testament was. And it was primarily copied by Christians. And so there has been the argument that Christians have sort of put certain statements in Josephus that were not in the original. And so that's problematic. And I don't want to get into the technical details of it here because I think it's more than you want to know. But at the very least, Josephus says Jesus existed during his time and that he had people following him because of the events, the miracles that he was involved in. That's pretty much acceptable by virtually everyone who critically studies Josephus. But we're not reliant upon Josephus alone for the idea that Jesus existed. There are other people who speak of Jesus in the first century. So let's look at a few of them. Other government officials and writers. So we have Tacitus from 112 who talks about the death of Jesus at the hands of Pilate. We have Lucian in the 2nd century who speaks about the new cult of Christianity. Remember, Christianity was seen as a cult by the Roman Empire. And there were 3 major claims made against the cult. The idea was that the cult did 3 things that were wrong. First of all, they were cannibalistic. And this comes from them having the love feast where they would say, "This is my body." And so the Romans misunderstood that, and they thought that they were actually eating someone's body. So the claim was that they were cannibalistic. The second claim against them is that they were atheistic. And by that, the Romans didn't mean they didn't believe that a God existed. They meant that they didn't believe in the God of the Romans. So you could have whatever God you wanted to in most Roman cities, but you also had to have their gods. And we know from, for instance, places like Paul's speech on Mars Hill in Acts, that there were a lot of gods around, and then there was a statue to an unknown God, just in case they had forgotten someone. So the first claim against Christianity was that it was cannibalistic. Second, that it was atheistic. And thirdly, that the Christian people intermarried. That is, that they would marry brothers and sisters. And this comes from the misunderstanding when Christians met together and would call one another brother or sister. So there were a variety of things that the Roman government didn't like about Christianity, and that's the reason that it's called a cult. Then there's Suetonius in 120, who says that Christ is the reason that the Jewish people were expelled from Rome. There's Pliny, who was a historian, and he mentions that Christians are bound not to sin because of Jesus. Thalius records this great darkness that happened at the time of Christ's death. There are other mentions of the darkness. And there's last on the list, as you see here, there's a comparison and contrast between the death of Socrates and the death of Christ. And the idea is that these same sort of calamities happened at each of those 3 deaths. And the point that I want you to take away from this slide is that there are a number of people, historians, who were not Christians, who were not followers of the Christ, who didn't read the New Testament, who didn't do any of that, and they speak of Christ having lived, of Christ having done some kind of miracles, and of Christ being crucified and claimed to have risen from the dead. So those are all very significant in the sense that we come to realize that the fact that Christ lived, did miracles, died, and people claimed his resurrection, that does not just come from the New Testament. It comes from a variety of other places. There are Jewish sources. The Talmud, for example. Now, there are two Talmuds, the Babylonian Talmud, from which this one comes, and the Jerusalem Talmud. The Talmud is essentially an explanation of the Mishnah. The Mishnah was written about 300 AD, Babylonian Talmud about between 5 and 600 AD. So this is a statement from the Babylonian Talmud. On the eve of the Passover, Yeshua was hanged. And so hanging was crucifixion. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, He is going to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf. But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of Passover. Now, you can see here that you can compare this Talmudic statement to a statement from John in John chapter 11. One of the things that we should realize about the Talmud is that it's not written until about 500 AD. And so clearly there's been some mixing up about exactly what the stories were in this statement. But I want you to realize this is a very strong piece of evidence, because it's an evidence that comes from the enemies of Christianity and Christian. And I say enemies in a historical sense. Not that they were at war or anything like that, but they were certainly not doing anything to sort of put Christianity forward. They did not want Christianity to go forward. And here in the Babylonian Talmud, we have this statement: Jesus lived, Jesus died. So it confirms the historicity of Jesus' life. Again, there are lots of places outside the New Testament where Jesus is mentioned by historians. It confirms not only the historicity of Jesus' life, it confirms the method of crucifixion. Now, the Jewish method of execution would have been stoning. They probably were not allowed to stone people by the Roman government. The Roman government didn't want people just putting people to death on their own. The government was supposed to do that. And so Jesus was killed by crucifixion, not by stoning. And it indicates that Jesus did do some sort of miraculous things. Here, they are attributing his power to the devil. Now, you want to pay careful attention here, because this is not something early. This is not something that only happens late. Let me say it that way. It's not something that only comes up in the 5th century. By that I mean, look at Mark 3:22 or Matthew 9, Matthew 12, where Jesus is often by his enemies said to do works by the power of the evil one. And so this claim about Jesus doing miracles but getting his power from the devil is not an unusual claim. It happens there, as you can see. And it indicates that Jesus gathered a variety of converts. So from a non-helpful source, we have the fact that Jesus lived, the fact that Jesus died, the fact that Jesus claimed to do miracles, and the fact that Jesus gathered a variety of converts. All of those things are very significant. Significant because they come from someone who was not loving of Christianity, and significant because they come from fairly early, about 400 to 500 AD. But there are also those who were less critical of Christianity, those who were Christians, called by Christians the early church fathers. And many of them will mention what Jesus did or what was going on here. In this chart, you can see a variety of early church fathers: Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, Hippolytus, Eusebius. And so you can recognize that what's going on in this chart, this is telling us how many of the verses of the New Testament show up in their writings. So for Justin Martyr, 268 verses from the Gospels show up in their writings. You can see that some of them are more dependent on Paul They will have many more verses from Paul. But what we see here is that the New Testament is in some way being preserved through the preaching of the early church fathers. They know that this text that they are reading is written by God, and they use it for their preaching. Then there are Gnostic sources. These are not sources who were Christian, but there are things like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter. All of these Gospels and many of them are very strange and have all kinds of really bizarre sort of things in which they conclude. But there's no doubt that these Gospels were written fairly early. You know, we don't know exactly the date for the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter, but we do know that they are claiming to save certain sayings by Jesus. The Gospel of Thomas particularly has many of the sayings from the Synoptic Gospels, and then it has some sayings that we don't find inside of the Gospels. So there's some fairly significant evidence there in the life of Jesus. But it's not just Gnostic sources. We can also think about archaeological evidence. Now, archaeological evidence has to be handled very, very carefully, because of what existed at the time of Jesus, only a small amount of that has survived. Of that small amount that has survived, an even smaller amount has been found. Every year we hear about other manuscripts being found or archaeological finds. Of the stuff that has been found, an even smaller amount has been cataloged into a library or a museum. And of that stuff that's been cataloged into a library or a museum, an even smaller amount has been actually carefully examined by scholars. So we want to be careful about the archaeological evidence, but there is some significance here. One is that sometimes you will hear, particularly around Easter time, you will hear the claim the burial place of Jesus has been found. Well, let's see about that. In the time of Jesus, only for about 60 or 80 years, there was an unusual method for burying people. People were buried in a tomb. Buried is not exactly what we would think of as being buried, but they were put into a tomb. One would wait until their flesh was gone, take a couple of years, and then they would place their bones inside of an ossuary or a bone box. Here is a picture of an ossuary, and on it, it says, Jesus, the son of Joseph. This was a very famous ossuary from a few years ago. Well, probably more than a few now, 10 or 15. It made national headlines as perhaps the ossuary of Jesus. But the thing to realize is that there were a lot of people named Jesus at this time. Here's a larger view of that same ossuary, and here's another looking at it. So the fact that we find the name Jesus doesn't necessarily mean in any sense that it is the same Jesus. When we find the name Jesus and he was a miracle worker, he had many followers, he was crucified, his followers said that he rose again, then we know that we're talking about the same Jesus. The name Jesus doesn't really do that. So what is it that we have? And we'll look back at this a little more next week. We have clearly historical claims by writers, and later we'll see by archaeological pieces, that Jesus did indeed actually exist. That those who were not Christians would say, yeah, there was a guy named Jesus. He claimed that he did miracles. He claimed that he was the Messiah, the Son of God, the Roman government, and he became crossed with one another, and he was crucified, died, and then his people said that he rose again. So all of that we can learn from people who were not writing the New Testament. And that's a significant thing, because what we learn about Jesus from his enemies or from people who didn't care about Christianity, at the very least, we can assume that they wouldn't be prone to telling things that they knew were untrue. So we realize that this gospel of Jesus Christ is true. We learn it from the New Testament, but we also learn it from a variety of other sources that exist outside of the New Testament. So we'll continue on with this, looking at it next week, but I hope that this has continued to shore up your faith and that it blesses you and that you know that we are not followers of fables, but we are followers of the truth of Jesus Christ. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week for Sunday School at the Cross.